what's up you guys, the Curious Owl here, and it is finally 2018, which means it's time for all of the worst and best books of 2017 videos to come out on BookTube, and today I decided to do my best of 2017 books. For the most part, during 2017, I had some pretty good reads. I had a lot more 3 and 4 star books than I had expected to, and I didn't really have many books that were 2 stars or lower, which I thought was an accomplishment in and of itself. But today I wanted to do my 5-star reads because I think these are the most important ones, as they are my highest rated ones, and I had quite a lot of them, as you can see from this stack, and I had several other books that I didn't have physically or I currently don't have for whatever reason that still made this list that were considered 5 stars, and so I'm really excited to tell you guys which ones I really enjoyed over the course of the last year. So how I'm going to do this is I'm going to go through each month and I will tell you guys what books in that month I had that were 5 stars and what I thought about them and a little bit about, what kind of made them 5-star reads for me. So without further ado, let's get started. So in January, my only 5-star read for the month was House of 13 by Andy Lockwood. This is actually a book that is written by a friend of one of my cousins. She had told me a lot about this book and said that she thought I would really enjoy it, and so she gave me a copy of it in the summer of 2016, and I had finally gotten to it in January 2017. And I absolutely loved it. It was so much better than I had expected, and especially for someone who is a up-and-coming author, this was his debut book, and really is a self-publishing author. I was really impressed with how this book ended up being, because the characters were really hilarious. They were very easy to relate to. It had a very interesting kind of magic system that was going on that almost seemed kind of supernatural in a sense. I loved the place that we were mostly in throughout the story, the Delaney house, and I just really loved everything that was incorporated in this novel. The only problems I really remember having with it is I wish that there would have been a little bit more in terms of how the main character essentially comes back to life after being hit by a bus, and so it just wasn't really well described, but that was something that Andy had later told me he is going to expand on, because he knows that he didn't go into it in this book, but he was looking to go into it in his further books, and as of right now, he is actually working on the 2nd book, which I'm so excited about, and I can't wait to see how this continues, because I remember falling in love with this book from the very first page. I think I remember saying in my review that I had read about 300 pages of this book in a day. In February, the only 5-star book that I had read was the book Abduction by Peg Carrot. I remember doing this review and absolutely being floored by how this book was, because it is actually, I think, to be a late elementary to early middle grade novel, but it deals with such a very, very heavy topic, and that is because the main character, who is a 5-year-old boy, is kidnapped by his estranged father for some kind of nefarious purpose, and his older sister Bobby, who's 13, has to essentially figure out where he is and try to get him back from this father figure that they have had no contact with in their entire lives. So it was really, really dark, and that was the thing I liked the most about it, because I thought it was a great way for someone who's maybe a little younger to get into things like mysteries and thrillers, because it definitely had a lot of those themes involved in it, and it was still light enough to where it wasn't going to traumatize the reader, but it definitely was very, very dark compared to a lot of other middle grade and elementary grade novels that I have read in the past. So in March and April, I didn't have any 5-star reads. I think I did have some 4 and 3 stars, but the next 5-star book didn't come to me until May, and that was the 3rd technically book in the Confessions of a Murder Suspect series by James Patterson and Maxine Petro, and that was Confessions of the Paris Mystery. If you guys have been here for several months, probably since the summer, you'll know that I accidentally read the 3rd book in the series as opposed to the 2nd book, because I thought this was the 2nd book, and I later did end up getting the 2nd book in the series, and I do plan on reading it at some point when I get a chance to. This book specifically in the series takes the Angel family to Paris, France, where they have to essentially live in Paris with their uncle and start going to a private school there, and they find out that they are actually in line for a very large inheritance from their grandmother, provided that they actually be on their best behavior and don't get into trouble, because this family is very notorious for getting themselves into trouble, and trouble does arise in here that threatens them losing the inheritance and things of that nature. And Tandy finds out some very, very interesting information about her older sister, who had supposedly passed away several years before, and a lot of dark things start to come out of here that she's not quite sure how to handle and understand at the moment, but it definitely sets up a lot of how the family has exactly been living in secrecy, which was really, really interesting. The reason it was a 5-star book for me was mostly because of the way that I read it, because although I didn't realize at the time that this was the 3rd book until I had finished it, this book honestly read almost as if it was a standalone novel in the series. Like, you could read this and understand everything that had happened before and not be confused, because James Patterson and Maxine Petro did a really good job of being able to give enough information in the story throughout that gave you enough of a background as to what happened in the 1st and 2nd books. In June, the 5-star book that I read was Save Me by Kristen Cusack Lewis. This is a more adult contemporary kind of novel and focuses on a woman who thinks that she basically has the perfect life, has the perfect husband and everything, and then finds out her husband has actually been cheating on her for a long period of time, and then an accident occurs that essentially brings him back to live with her in the house that they lived in for several years and have been trying to remodel, all while she is trying to cope with the fact that her husband cheated on her in the first place. And it was a very heartbreaking novel, but I remember loving it so much, despite the fact that it actually scared me at the moment, because I remember having to go to my boyfriend's house afterwards after having read this book and stay with him, because I was so scared that something was happening with him that was causing him to have feelings for someone else. And that was only because I felt I connected so much with the main character. I really felt that she and I had a lot in common in the ways that we kind of see ourselves and the way that we see the relationships we have with other people. And so it really made me scared. So I want anyone that reads this to understand that you may get a little bit kind of freaked out when you read this book. It is very heartbreaking. It is a very serious novel, but it definitely has some warnings that come with it, because if you read this book and you're currently in a relationship, you're going to be questioning a lot of stuff about your relationship that I was questioning, and it kind of scares you. But it still was a 5-star read for me, because I was really able to empathize with the main character in a lot of ways, and the back and forth that she had throughout the novel was very easy to see and very understandable and empathizable with me, because although I've not exactly been in her situation, I definitely understand how she was going through her coping and trying to understand what it was she did wrong, if she did anything wrong. And it was just one of those novels that I think has always stuck out to me over the course of this year and was definitely worth the read. So in July, I ended up having 2 books that were 5-star reads. The first being All the Bright Places by Jennifer Niven. This book broke my heart so much, and I want to place very strong trigger warnings for suicide, bipolar disorder, and depression and suicidal tendencies, all that stuff, because literally this book is about 2 teenagers who are both suicidal, and they find each other and really try to see how they can help each other. And it's a wonderful love story between these 2, but it's also incredibly sad because of the fact that it deals with things like suicide and depression. I went into this novel knowing mostly about the suicide trigger warnings that were going into it, but I really did not think that I was going to attach myself to these characters so easily. And I think that's one of the reasons I loved this book so much, is that I connected so much with the female main character. Despite the fact that I don't have really a lot in common with her, I was still able to connect with her very well. And I just felt so sad about everything that happened in the novel, and I ugly cried in this novel. And it's been a long time since I've ugly cried at any book, in a long time. Like, probably not since I was in middle school have I ugly cried at a book. And this one in particular really made me ugly cry, not just because of the topics that it involved, but the reasoning afterwards of things that happen to one of the characters, things that she does and why she does it. It's definitely one of those books that I think that people, when they read it, need to tread lightly into, and they need to know their limits in terms of the things that they are reading, because it is very triggering, I think, in some instances. But it's still a really good novel to read, because it truly looks at suicide in a very different light than I think a lot of other people don't quite get at the moment. The second book in July was another very heavy book, and that was Identical by Ellen Hopkins. Many of you may know Ellen Hopkins is one of my favorite authors of all time, because she writes in prose, which makes her novels very long and very thick. But this one in particular focuses on 2 twin sisters who, one of them is being sexually abused by their father, and the other is essentially vying for his attention and kind of wants the life that her twin sister has. And the reasoning that it was so heavy was not only because of the sexual abuse, which there's a huge trigger warning for, but it was the emotional and the physical and the mental abuse that kind of goes on that is being talked about with one of these characters. The fact that she really can't trust anyone because of the abuse that she endures, and almost the kind of psychotic nature of the other sister. It's very heavy to read through, and while it was that, it still was a very fast read for me. As I said, the novel is written in prose, so it's very quick to read through. Each section is usually divided between one sister and then going into the other. And the ending, my God, the ending was a total twist for me, and so that is one thing I would recommend people to look at, is this twist that goes in with this novel. But again, please tread lightly into it because it does deal with some very strong themes of sexual abuse, and so for those of you who maybe have been victims of sexual abuse, I would tell you to stray away from this, because even as a person that has not been sexually abused in their lives as of yet, I found this to be very, very emotionally triggering, because I could not imagine how I would be in that situation. Although that it was very hard for me to get through this book at the time, Ellen Hopkins, I think, does a wonderful job with being able to sensitively talk about these things, but at the same time expose these things that are happening in our world for what they really are, as being evil and inhumane and just really, really awful in general. In August, I also had 2 5-star reads. Both were much more lighthearted than in July. The first being Fractured Fairy Tales by A.J. Jacobs. This was actually a book that was recommended to me from a student that I was working with in the writing center who is much older than me. She is going into getting her bachelor's degree, and I had to work with her in the writing center a few different times over the course of that semester, and she easily became one of my very good friends, and she recommended this to me because we were talking about basically stories that were fairy tales that had been twisted and had been reimagined and doing retellings and things of that nature. And so she recommended this book to me, which apparently is a collection of short stories that were actually done in a TV show like several years ago. I wouldn't be able to tell you how long ago these were going on, but basically this is a collection of short stories of fairy tales that we know and love, but they're very different than how we normally tell them. Hence the name Fractured. And I can't tell you how many times I laughed in this book. I thought it was so cute the way that it was written, and definitely it was one of my favorites because of how lighthearted it was and how it really brought me out of that funk of reading 2 books back to back that were so heavy. And so I just really love this book. I thought it was hilarious. The second book I read in August that was a 5-star read for me was Everything Everything by Nicola Yoon. This was a little bit more lighthearted than Identical and All the Bright Places, but it still had some very heavy themes, especially about sickness, and because it's all about this girl who essentially is what I would consider to have like Bubble Boy syndrome. If you guys remember anything about Bubble Boy, basically she can't go out of her house because she's apparently so sick that if she was to step outside of her home, she could pretty much die from absolutely anything that is out in the outside world. Then a boy moves in next door to their house, and she has this weird kind of thing for him. She really thinks that she likes him, and they start communicating back and forth, and their relationship kind of goes from there. It's a really heartwarming story about these 2 coming together and really kind of talking about taking risks and knowing that risks sometimes are worth them, and that sometimes you can gain so much out of life by taking risks. And so I really enjoyed this story. I thought it was very heartwarming. I will say that after having read this and had taken some time away from it, I will agree that a lot of the things that were involved in this novel were kind of problematic in terms of the way that the mother character was done and the way that she was treating her daughter. And I do see that stuff is problematic, but at the time when I read it, I hadn't heard any of that stuff, so I wanted to keep my rating as it was at that time, which was 5 stars. But I will say, though, that since time has passed, I probably would knock it down to a 4-star, just because of how problematic the mother character really is in this novel. The next book that was a 5-star rating for me in September was the audiobook for Feel Good 101 by Emma Blackery. I had a whole rant and rave about this novel when I had done my first audiobook review of it in September, because this book was so freaking good. This is Emma's first book, and if you don't know who Emma Blackery is, she is a YouTuber and a musician, and she makes these videos that talk a lot about her life and things of that nature. She's had several channels over the last like 10 years, I think, or so, since she's been on YouTube, and she's a really interesting person. She's very sarcastic in nature, and she really doesn't take anybody's crap, really. And this novel mostly has essays dealing about different parts of her life where she experienced hardships and lessons that she feels that need to be addressed. And it's not supposed to be a real self-help book like the title would lead you to believe. It's more of her telling her stories in the chance that somebody out there may have been dealing with the same thing, and they can see that, you know, they weren't alone in that situation. There's been somebody else that has been in that situation themselves, and I really enjoyed it because there were a lot of pieces of it that I think really connected with me. Now, obviously, I didn't connect with her on every single thing that she had dealt with because some of her anxieties were very different from mine, but her talk on anxiety in general definitely made me feel more connected with her because of the way that she discussed it, being very careful with the way that she was talking about it, but at the same time understanding that, you know, it's different for everyone, but there are some ways that you can kind of help yourself to help relieve you of your anxieties and things of that nature. And she talks about everything from her YouTube career, starting out, her music career, having separation anxiety from her father, sex, love, everything under the sun she talks about in this book in specific essays, and really emphasizes the fact that you are your own person and you are the one that makes your own decisions, and you have to make your decisions based on what you think is best and from nobody else's opinion. And I really, really enjoyed it. The narration of it too was done by Emma Blackery herself, and so it made it so much more fun to listen to because it actually felt like I was talking with her as opposed to her just reading me this book. It actually felt that she was there with me, telling me these stories herself, and I just loved it so much, and I love Emma Blackery with all my heart. She's one of my favorite YouTubers, and I just really, really enjoyed it. It was one of the best things I think I had listened to all year. The next book in September that I read that was a 5-star read was The Unexpected Everything by Morgan Matson. This one is about a girl who essentially finds out her father, who is a politician, is under some kind of possible scandal, and it causes her to lose her internship or summer kind of class thing that she's doing with Johns Hopkins Medical Center, where she wanted to go over the summer, and essentially has to change her entire summer plans. And some things work out really well for her, some things don't, and it's really just seeing her progress over this summer and really becoming a whole new person because of the fact that her plans had gone up in flames. I love this book so much because I identified with Andy so much because I am one of those type A people where if things change at the drop of a hat and I'm not prepared for it, I will freak the F out. I kid you not. Like, it has happened so many times where things have gone completely awry, my plans have gone up in flames, and I am left spiraling and have no idea what to do. And so this novel I thought was very thought-provoking for me in terms of how I need to kind of be a little bit more lenient with how things go. And my anxieties a lot of the time will stem from these things that change drastically when I'm not prepared for it and I don't have a backup plan. It was really good for me to read this book to see how much I identified with Andy, because then I kind of started thinking of ways that I could kind of be more lenient with when things are changing, and always reminding myself that things can't always go the way I plan, and I have to be prepared for that, and I have to have a backup plan when things don't go the way that I want them to. So this novel did a lot for me in the time that I had read it. It definitely was something I needed at the moment. So in October, I had 3 books that were all 5 stars, and the first was the audiobook version of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. As you guys may know, I started doing my reread in about October of the Harry Potter series, and I was really, really excited because I started with the audiobook version from Audible, and oh my god, was it such a nostalgia trip for me. I loved the audiobook so much. It was very easy to follow. I normally would read it in between classes, like walking to and from class, or when I was sitting at lunch by myself, or when I really had any downtime in work or things of that nature, when I wasn't working on anything in particular or working with a student. So I had a lot of time where I was able to listen to this book, and so it was so fun to listen to it as opposed to read it because it was something I was not familiar with. This is when I was still really getting into listening to audiobooks more. I definitely thought that it was a much more enjoyable experience, especially since I know the Sorcerer's Stone like the back of my hand. So it was really, really cool to listen to, and really just kickstarted this idea of doing the reread. So it was definitely a 5-star for nostalgia purposes, but I do appreciate the way that J.K. Rowling was able to start building the wizarding world for us in this novel. There was so much that was incorporated in it that really, honestly, just made this series what it was. And honestly, I think if it had not been for the way that J.K. Rowling had written it, there was no way that there would be the Harry Potter fandom that there is today, because the Sorcerer's Stone was really where it all started, and people fell in love with it, and then when the movies came out, they were all so excited about it. The fandoms just grew and grew, and so J.K. Rowling definitely has a special place in my heart for that. The next book that was a 3-star read for me in October was the audiobook version of The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. If you guys watched my diversity in books discussion, I talked a lot about this book and the reason that it was a 5-star book for me, and I had a very lengthy discussion of the review itself when I had done this. This was another audiobook that I really enjoyed and I think was better than if I had read the actual print version, because the way that the narration was done in The Hate You Give, it was very visual. I could see these very, very strong scenes that were going in with the book, and I just think the narration was so well done with that it made the story much more enjoyable. I think if I had read the book itself, I definitely still would have enjoyed it a lot, but there is something to be said about the way that a person is able to narrate a story, and if it's done well, it's obviously going to do what it did for me, which was give me a story that really, I think, can stand the test of time. And I know that recently, especially, this book has been starting to be implemented into classrooms when talking about race and diversity and basically the racial problems that are going on in the world. The third book that was a 5-star read for me in October was, of course, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets by J.K. Rowling, the second book in the Harry Potter series. Again, mostly for nostalgia purposes. I know this movie like the back of my hand too, and I discussed that basically books 1 through 3 I know super, super well. They're my favorite ones out of the entire franchise, and then books 4 through 7 I'm kind of a little bit more fuzzy on because I didn't care for 4 so much, and 5 and 6 were really kind of not there. I hadn't finished the 7th book, and so this one was definitely another nostalgia factor for me. But regardless, I really enjoyed Chamber of Secrets just as much as the Sorcerer's Stone, but this one had a lot more going for it because we really had to delve into a lot of the more darker elements of the wizarding world, with the basilisk and the Chamber of Secrets being opened again for the first time in 50 years, essentially since Voldemort was at Hogwarts. And so we start to really get some ideas as to how powerful Voldemort used to be, and starting to kind of piece together some information about his past. So November was my best reading month by far for the year because I had 4 books in the month of November that were all 5-star reads. Number 1 being Turtles All the Way Down by John Green, the newest book that John Green has come out with that came out in October, and my God, was this book wonderful. It focuses on a character who has OCD and anxiety, and essentially is more so about that and how it basically overtakes her life, with a subplot of being where she and her best friend find out that a billionaire has essentially gone missing. Asa, the main character, finds out that it's the father of an old childhood friend of hers that she begins to reconnect with. But the story mostly revolves around her OCD and anxiety and how that really affects her relationships and how she interacts with people and how she views herself and things of that nature. I will say that after having read it and listening to some other people talk about it, that it definitely had some problematic themes in it, mostly dealing with the best friend, but I really enjoyed the fact that the best friend was a absolute awful person because it really exemplified how very insensitive a lot of people can be in terms of when they have people that they know that are suffering from OCD or anxiety or any kind of other mental illness. Because unfortunately for people who don't have mental illnesses of any kind, they don't understand exactly what it is that is going on with the person that they know that has a mental illness. So I do like the fact that John Green incorporated that kind of a character into this novel because it is something that we need to discuss. We need to be able to discuss mental illness with people who don't know about mental illness so much. And I really liked it. I know a lot of people really didn't like that aspect of it, but I personally enjoyed it. The only problem I really had with it that I didn't really knock many points off for with John Green was the fact that there was a little bit of a problematic nature in the way that Asa viewed her medication, because medication is something that definitely can work for some people and it should be emphasized more in novels, but unfortunately we see a lot of characters that do not think of medication as very helpful. And although that is totally normal for some people, I definitely think that it's more important for us to recognize that medication can be very helpful if it's taken correctly. The second book in November that was a 5-star read for me was Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, the third book in the Harry Potter series. Really, this is just a nostalgia thing for me again because this book is my favorite book in the entire franchise because there's so much that's involved with it and it really changes the tone of the entire series. After this book, things start to become much darker after Harry finds out about a lot of things about Sirius and his connection with Sirius and the way that his parents were murdered and things of that nature. Following up with that, the next book is The Goblet of Fire, which is the 4th book in the Harry Potter series. This one mostly focuses on the Triwizard Tournament, which is a new thing that is coming up for the first time in I think about a century is what they talk about, and Harry somehow, despite being underage, is placed in the tournament. and everyone thinks that he cheated, that somehow he slipped his name into the goblet, but Harry knows that there's something else that's going on, something much darker and much more sinister, and it's up to him, Ron, and Hermione, along with several other characters, to try to figure out what is going on and why he's being put in this Triwizard Tournament in the first place. And this is where this really starts to get very dark in the Harry Potter world, because a lot of the things that come up for Harry as he's going through the Triwizard Tournament, and especially towards the very end of the novel, things really start to become much more heavy-handed, and the end of this novel, as many people will know, is really the biggest turning point for Harry, because a lot of things happen to him that he's unable to cope with, that spill over into the Order of the Phoenix, that really shapes the way he looks at the world and how he views himself and how he kind of just views everything in general. The fourth and final book in November that was a 5-star read for me was the audiobook for The Thing About Jellyfish by Ali Benjamin. This again is another very heavy story, as it deals with a 12-year-old girl who finds out that an old friend of hers has essentially drowned, and she doesn't believe that it was a drowning accident because this friend in particular was a very good swimmer. She thinks that something else has happened to her, and essentially deduces it down to the fact that it's possible that her friend was stung by a jellyfish and was killed. And so a lot of this novel is a lot of backtracking into the friendship with this girl and how it became very toxic and very sad in a way, and then also moving forward with her going with this project and trying to figure out, did jellyfish really kill her friend, and if so, what can she do to try to avoid it happening again. It was really heartbreaking for me because the friendship that she describes with this girl in this novel is very similar to something that I had experienced in my life, where I had a friend that I was really, really close with. I considered to be a sister, and then as we got older, she really kind of turned her back on me, and I really had a hard time with making connections afterwards, after a very specific event had happened. And so I really connected with the main character of this novel because I'd essentially been through the exact same thing, and I knew how it felt to feel left in the dust and to feel that I was alone. And so unfortunately for me, I did cry a lot in this novel. So in December, I ended up having no 5-star reads. Everything was either 3 or 4 stars for me in December. And so that's pretty much all of the books that I read over the course of 2017 that was a 5-star read. So yeah, let me know what you guys thought of these books yourselves, if you thought of them the same way I did, what you guys had rated those books. And yeah, so if you guys did enjoy this video, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you're not already and you'd like to be, hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys!